I'm Dr. Tom Hartz. I'm a volunteer naturalist at the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge and a member of the board of the Friends of the Refuge. Our refuge is a very special place. We're fortunate to have a National Wildlife Refuge in our community. And today I'd like to give you a little background about the refuge and the Friends of the Refuge and share some information about a couple of restoration projects that are taking place on what we call the main unit in Sherwood, right off I-99, right off Route 99. So the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge was established in 1992. The Friends of the Refuge was established at the end of 1993. The refuge includes land between Tigard and Sherwood along I-99, which is open to the public. It also includes other land around the Sherwood and Tualatin communities that are not open to the public. We also have a new parcel of land that was added to the refuge. We are now not a National Wildlife Refuge, but we are a National Wildlife Refuge complex because Wapato Lake is a National Wildlife Refuge that is part of the Tualatin River complex. The Friends of the Refuge supports the Fish and Wildlife Service in its restoration work, as well as offering educational programs and activities to the local community. The acquisition boundary, which is the land that is authorized by the federal government for the refuge to acquire, includes 33,060 acres in Sherwood, 4,310 acres in Wapato Lake. The refuge currently manages over 2,150 of that 7,400 acre allotment. All of the land that's allowed to be acquired by the refuge is purchased at fair market price from people that are willing to sell it. And we currently have several parcels of land that have been purchased, but they're not allowed to have visitors at those particular sites. I assume, maybe I shouldn't assume, but I hope that most of the people on the call have been to the refuge and know what it's all about. But if you haven't, I encourage you to do so because some really exciting things are happening now. A little bit of data about visitations. I tease the kids whenever we have field trips, asking them, we have 3 rules at the refuge. There's no running, there's no bicycles, and there's no pets. It's not a zoo, it's not a park, it's a refuge. And so I asked the kids, with those constraints in mind, how many visitors do you think we get at the refuge on a typical cold, rainy day in November? And I asked, how many think it's 100? A couple kids will raise their hand. How many think it's 500? A couple kids will raise their hand. Well, the number that I'm looking for is we have over 20,000 visitors per day in the end of November and into December. There's a record of 50,000 visitors at the refuge. And the kids all show me this puzzled look. And I said, well, the refuge is all about wildlife, all about the animals and the habitat. We're talking visitors in terms of waterfowl that are doing their migration. For human visitation, we have about 180,000 per year visit the refuge. The refuge sits on what's called the Pacific Flyway. The Pacific Flyway goes from Alaska all the way through Canada, the United States, Mexico, and into South America. 10 to 12 million birds, including songbirds, ducks and geese, cranes and raptors, migrate along the flyway to reach feeding places and raise their young. Wildlife refuges in the United States and Alaska, that's part of the United States, dot the flyway along the coast. There's refuges pretty much along the coast, and we remain in contact with each other, so we know what's going on, what birds are migrating, and when. It's quite a fraternity, if you will, of refuges. The refuges provide places where these migrating species can rest and eat during their long trips. Some of the birds, particularly geese, will fly for 48 hours straight before they decide it's time to rest and replenish themselves. So I have a few pictures that I've taken during the migration season. These are from a few years ago. And this was a cold November morning. And this first picture shows the one on the right. There's frost and ice on the trail because the sun is rising behind me when I took this picture over the structure that's on the left, which is the environmental education shelter at the refuge. So this was shortly before full sunrise. This next picture shows what I saw. If you look at all those specks and dots, those are geese that are flying into the refuge and then flying away. At daybreak, the refuge, what we call, wakes up. The birds that have spent the previous night and are ready to move on begin singing to wake up their mates. And birds that have spent the previous night at the refuge either fly on by or to another destination or circle the refuge during their descent onto the wetlands. So you can imagine the cacophony of noises and bird calls that are happening all morning and into the day as the birds fly over that are going further south or fly around and land to spend the next night at the refuge. It's very, very dramatic. The various species of birds tend to migrate, feed, and rest together. So you see little packets of similar species of ducks and geese and other birds that are on their migration path. There's a couple examples of some waterfowl that are replenishing themselves in preparation for their next phase of the trip. But thousands of birds continue further south than the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge during the fall migration. Others stick around and spend the winter here in Oregon and raise their young at the National Wildlife Refuge in the spring. There's a couple that swallows on the left, and there's a duck on the right. And what the Fish and Wildlife Service's mission is, with regard to the migration, is to provide a haven for wildlife. And the Friends of the Refuge support that mission. We have 7 or 8 regular staff of Fish and Wildlife Service federal employees, and we're supplemented by over 330 members, many of whom are volunteers at the refuge, to help do the plantings and the educational programs and the activities that we do in support of the Fish and Wildlife Service's mission. These birds are ones that have decided to stick around through the spring. The ducks on the left, a male and female partnership. And on the right, that little fuzzy thing in the middle is a great horned owlet that was hatched and fledged from the refuge a couple of years ago. We have several great horned owls at the refuge. This next picture I find interesting because this is late spring, early summer, when the birds are pretty much at adult size. Birds grow really fast. In about 6 weeks, they're at adult size and have fledged and can typically fly on from there. When they're large enough to fly, those that decide that they're going to go back up north to continue their growth and nourish themselves up there, they head back north until the next migration season. But I'd like you to remember the picture of this path that these birds are walking on. To the left is a canal that was used to, when the refuge was a farm for agricultural purposes. That was the water that was used to irrigate the fields that are on the refuge. The entire refuge, the site that we have open on I-99, was a pig, cattle, and crop farm. And over the first few years of the refuge, the farmland was turned into a restoration project, where we are trying to restore what the refuge is to what it was before there were farmlands, a couple hundred years ago. It's a big job. So how does the Refuge Friends, or how does the Friends support refuge projects? Well, projects on the refuge are planned and managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service staff. Federal funding provides the staff salaries and support, equipment, facilities, basically keeps the lights on. Projects that drive the efforts of the Fish and Wildlife Service to support the Comprehensive Conservation Plan, which is a huge document that was created when the refuge was established. It's about, 1,500 pages describing all of the activities that are going to be done at the refuge. It documents what species of animals are currently present, how to keep track of how many of them are growing, and then the types of development that are going to be allowed across the 7,400 acres that represent the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge complex. That CCP was approved by the Department of the Interior when the refuge was created. And then each year since 1992, the refuge staffs developed an annual work plan that guides the refuge activities for that current fiscal year. Now the Friends write grant proposals to foundations and community partners to help fund specific projects. Volunteers help staff those projects and programs on the refuge and out into the community. So this morning, I'd like to look at a couple of projects that have taken place at the main unit on Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge. Historically, Chicken Creek, which is, let's see if you can see my cursor here. This is Chicken Creek. It wanders through the refuge, but whenever the refuge was a farm, Chicken Creek basically was dried up because the canal, which you saw in the picture with the geese, ran along this service road and diverted the water from the refuge over here into the Tualatin River. Historically, the creek wandered through the refuge, wetlands. And we're going to talk about a project that recreated Chicken Creek in all its glory back to what it was before the farmland was put into place. So we're going to focus on two restoration projects today. The first is what we call the 1P, 2P project. This is 1 and this is 2. Historically, whenever the refuge was formed, there were 6 different parcels that were separated and managed differently as to what type of habitat they are. Wetlands, or in this area, 1P and 2P, which are now these 2 parcels, are they're supported. The water to support 1P and 2P comes from a creek that's over on this side, Rock Creek. This area over here, which was 2, 6, or 1, 2, 5, and 6, will become new wetlands or restored wetlands whenever the project is done, like you see in this slide at the bottom. All of this will become a 280 acre continuous wetland when the project is complete. The water will be supplied and run through the refuge on Chicken Creek. At the end of the construction project, the Tualatin unit, which is what we call, what's the Native Americans call this particular area, will contain these 280 acres connected floodplain and only the 3 managed wetlands, 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to remove a section of trail, this section here, went through the wildlife refuge before, and we'll recreate the seasonal trail down here. But before all of the work on Chicken Creek began, we wanted to restore the wetlands in the 1P, 2P designation. Again, this area over here, right in front of the visitor center at the entranceway to the wetlands. 1P, 2P, the P stands for permanent. They're permanent wetlands as opposed to what we had previously called in this viewing. These were S, which is seasonal. There were seasonal wetlands where we controlled the water that went on and off the refuge by that canal and how much we either pumped back onto the refuge or withdrew from the refuge the water that was in the wetlands so that we could maintain the habitat for the animals. So 1P, 2P, let's see, where's my stuff here. 1P, 2P addresses the restoration of the land closest to the overlook at the visitor center. Volunteers have routinely removed invasive species from the property. Invasive plants don't need much of a toehold in order to take dominance in the native plants structure. So we did a thorough removal of the invasive plants and planting of native plants on 1P and 2P in a cooperative project between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Friends. So here's how we did that. First, Fish and Wildlife Service came in with their heavy equipment and pulled out or removed as many of the invasive plants as they could from that area. Then the Friends came in and put new plants in the ground. We got a very nice day. The soil was pretty muddy, but families came out and everybody was instructed on how and where to plant these new plants so that they could gain a foothold before the rains came. And then over time, new plants started to grow. And now we're ready to restore Chicken Creek. So how did the Friends participate in this? Well, the Friends contributed $30,000 to the restoration project that covered the planting materials, helped plan for the development and how it was going to take place, and brought in some contract workers. The results of the effort will be a very visible enhancement to the beauty of the refuge, as well as improving the flow of the wetland habitats that supports the wildlife that are dependent on the wetlands. That was a big project, but it was done in just a matter of weeks. Let's go to a much more complicated project that is taking a couple of years now and probably won't be completed until sometime this fall. We call it the Chicken Creek Restoration Project. And I found this logo online. I thought it was perfectly appropriate for what we were talking about here. Fish and Wildlife Service has been actively restoring the refuge land. The property that's open to the public was a farm and was acquired, as we discussed. Pigs, cattle, and crops were raised in the lands for decades. Water was provided by the canal. So again, we're going to connect Chicken Creek to the Tualatin River, as we saw on the map earlier. We're basically recreating what's called a riparian habitat. Riparian habitats imply that they are along lakes, rivers, or streams. And the habitat includes the soil and air and water that are in that particular environment. Sometimes riparian habitats only see water during certain parts of the year. And the interesting thing is that the water supply is close enough for the plant roots to reach the water. So there's riparian plants that do well in a wet environment, and then there are other plants that don't do so well in the wet environment. By way of example, several years ago, we had an eagle's nest that was right in the middle of the wetlands that were visible from the visitor center on top. The eagle's nest was huge. It was, it existed in a very tall and very old white oak tree. Over time, white oaks do not do well in very wet soil. So whenever the farms were taken out and the water was diverted from that particular part of the refuge, that oak tree didn't survive. PGE came out and literally attached a phone pole, or the telephone pole, to the branch that the eagle's nest was on, hoping to keep the nest in place as the tree kind of grew weak and died. But eventually, the branch that the eagle's nest was on became too big and the tree became too weak. And even with the telephone pole to help, the branch collapsed and the eagle nest was basically destroyed when it hit the ground. The eagle's nest can be 10 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and weigh over 2,000 pounds. So it was a real tragedy to lose it because we had eagles that successfully hatched eaglets and they fledged in the refuge. And it was sad to see the nest go, but now we have other nests around the refuge areas that kind of filled the gap. So the riparian ecosystem includes the plants and animals that the habitat supports. So the riparian habitat supports the riparian ecosystem and allows all the animals to survive. So let's summarize what the Chicken Creek project was all about. The objective was to recreate the ecosystem that existed before the land was a cattle farm, but the goal is to redirect the creek to how it was long ago. So there's several steps that we have to do in order for that to happen. And I'll show you each of those steps. We don't need to draw down the water from the area to be restored. We remove the channels that have been used to provide water for the farm. Those channels have been removed. Then we want to prepare the path for the Chicken Creek to follow, add features that will make the creek attractive to wildlife. If you visit the refuge now, if you look out over the wetlands, you'll see these huge, looks like stack of tree trunks that were brought in to create the path that Chicken Creek actually followed, and we'll see how that happens. It will go a long way in making the creek attractive to wildlife by providing shelter, by providing nutrients to the animals that live in the creek, and make for a very beautiful display of what goes on. And when I first started volunteering at the refuge, I was talking to the refuge manager, and I asked her, how are you going to create the creek? I mean, you're going to have all this heavy equipment out there digging the creek. And she said, no, we'll make the path for the creek, make it attractive with all these huge logs that we're burying in there. And then the beavers will come. Okay. We've also installed a couple of bridges that cross the creek so that we can have human access to the trails. And then we'll relocate the fish upstream. And we'll talk about how they do that. And then and only then can we redirect the water to the restored Chicken Creek path. So let's go through these steps. First, we draw the water down. This is a canal that went across the front of the refuge from where those geese were on the path, directly perpendicular to that into the Tualatin River. What you're looking at here are great blue herons that are nicely socially distanced along the channel, hunting for fish in the water. We have, I don't know, hundreds of great blue herons that are on the refuge during the course of the year, and it's amazing to watch them hunt. They're very effective. Big birds. And then the second step was to prepare the path for Chicken Creek. And these are some water structures that were put to direct the flow of the water onto what will become Chicken Creek itself. This was water that's just been collected during normal rainfall. This isn't Chicken Creek being functional. This is the water that will be on the wetlands that would also include Chicken Creek. On the right, you can see this is one of those types of wood structures that were placed in the ground to support the flow of the Chicken Creek whenever it gets in place. Here are some heavy equipment that are putting those clumps of logs into the path. And as you remember from the map that showed Chicken Creek kind of zigzags all through the refuge. So it doesn't quite look like a path or a well thought out plan, but actually it is. It's the footprint of what Chicken Creek was historically. There are some more of those log patterns that you can see here, how the patterns are, the trees have been placed in a direction that will become the actual path of Chicken Creek. So again, here's that map that shows Chicken Creek. And what you're looking at is these areas through here that will become Chicken Creek whenever everything is restored. And a bridge will be placed over here by what we call the photo line, and there'll be a bridge over here at the entrance to the distant entrance to the refuge itself. And again, all of this 280 acres will become permanent wetlands. And then the beavers started to come. Even before we've completed the restoration of Chicken Creek, there are little streams that are adjacent to the refuge and direct the flow of water during the rainy season. And here's a couple of examples of beaver dams that have been created under a bridge. The shadow is the bridge, one of the bridges that are currently on the refuge, That used to be a big problem. The dams that the beavers made historically interfered with the way the Fish and Wildlife Service was trying to manage the level of water on the refuge. So it was kind of a game of who's gonna lose first, or who's gonna give up first. Every night the beavers would drag in some more branches, dam up the creek. Whenever we had to drain the water off, the Fish and Wildlife Service people would go in with their waders and pull the branches off, put them on the bank, and the next night the beavers would bring them back again. So now they can do this as a part of the project. We've always had, my computer's a little jumpy. We've always had a lot of evidence of beavers on the refuge. If you're walking any of the trails now and you look around, you can certainly see beaver chew. This type of chew happens every night of the year, and you can see that it's beaver chew from the distinctive striation that the beaver's teeth leave in the wood whenever they cut it down. This is a good size piece of wood. Maybe it's 2 inches across, 2 inches in diameter. That's a good piece of wood for the beavers to use as part of their dam, and then they supplement that with other sticks and debris to kind of dam the water. Beavers are predominantly nocturnal, but you can see these signs of beavers all around the refuge. It's very exciting to kids when they're walking on the trails and they say, I don't see any beavers. Well, that's because they don't come out during the day very much, but you can see where they've been, and you can see fresh chew, and you point that out to the kids and they get very engaged with hoping to see a beaver one day. So the wildlife is returning. This is from this past fall, where the waterfowl are flying over and landing in the refuge and spending their time there. You can see in this picture in the lower left, hundreds of geese and waterfowl were on the banks. They'll rest up there. Again, they fly for a long time before they decide they need a break. And and then they rest up. You can see them, they bathe in the water that's there because they collect a lot of debris on them when they're flying for many hours at a time. We have black-tailed deer that inhabit the refuge, and even with all the construction activity that's going on, as you can see up here, the deer hung around. It's very obvious that because this is a national wildlife refuge, obviously we don't trap animals and bring them to the refuge for display like you might at a zoo, but the animals are at the refuge because they want to be at the refuge. We provide food and shelter and space for them to be able to do whatever their native behaviors are. And the riparian ecosystem is continuing to thrive. Fawns are born on the refuge yearly, bush rabbits, great blue herons. This eagle on the lower left here is an eagle that is doing its hunting thing. Eagles hunt in a very interesting way. This eagle is hunting right now. He looks like he's kind of lazy, just sitting there. But what he's doing is looking out into the wetlands and trying to eye where he thinks he's going to take his next meal. What happens is the eagle will decide, okay, it's time for me to make sure that I've got the right animal. So it flies out of the tree. And all of the birds and waterfowl that are on the refuge or on the wetlands take off at once. You can hear this huge din of screaming birds taking off and flying away. Well, the eagle circles around, it goes back to his perch and watches again. After 20 minutes, a half hour, the eagle will take off again and go pick the goose or duck that didn't fly away or was among the last to fly away, and goes down and takes that as its next meal. It's very dramatic. And when you are on the refuge and you hear all the screaming of ducks and geese, be on the lookout. You'll probably see an eagle that's circling overhead. And then watch what happens when he goes back to his perch and does the whole catch the next waterfowl trick. Well, I mentioned that a step that is next to be done is redirecting the water and opening the floodgates, if you will. And what we don't want to do is to wash all of the fish and lamprey that are in the refuge waters now back into the Tualatin River. Because as you may know, particularly trout and salmon, remember where they were hatched. And whenever the eggs hatch and the fish grow into medium sized, and it's time for them to migrate back into the larger rivers and ultimately the ocean to grow, they remember where they were hatched. And whenever it's time for them to spawn, they go back to the place where they were hatched. If we flushed all of those waterfowl out, it could take decades before we had enough fish that realize that, hey, this is a great place to spawn. But rather, we would like to seed it with fish that are already spawned there. So I'll show you a little video of how we're going to be capturing and relocating the fish and lamprey that are on the refuge by returning them to the headwaters of Chicken Creek. So bear with me while I try to start this video. I hope you can hear this. If not, yell.
I don't hear anything, Tom.
Well, what I'll do is describe what she's saying. This is a Fish and Wildlife Service employee, and those two devices that she's holding are electrodes. There's an anode and a cathode, and what's on her back is a source of electricity. So what she's going to do is to direct the fish into an area where there's netting and they can be captured with those two anodes, with those two electrodes. So she draws the fish into the area that she has somebody that's going to be there to catch them. The interesting thing about what she's doing is that lamprey are buried in the ground, kind of like an earthworm. And they're a very important creature for the Native Americans historically. And they're basically food for everybody, just like an earthworm would be. So with a very low current, they tease the osprey out of their mud and capture them that way. Osprey on the refuge right now tend to be about anywhere from 6 to 8 inches long and blind. They don't have any eyes. When it's time for them to spawn, they develop eyes and go out into the spawning area and do their spawning thing and create their babies. So the question was, how does this person walk around in the water with voltages going through the water and not put herself in danger? The backpack has a little, like what they call a dead man switch in it, where if she leans over too far, it turns off the electricity, or if she would have fallen in the water, it would turn off the electricity. And she gets an audio feedback from the electrodes that they're alive and working. And if she lets go of the button that holds them on, that also shuts down the current. And so, of course, whenever they do this particular job, they do it in groups of people. So sometimes it's at least a team of 2, but typically 4 or 5 others may come along if they expect to get a lot of fish and do the netting. She's explaining here that the voltage that they use for bony fish, like cutthroat trout, is stronger than the one that they use for the lamprey. They call it a tickle current that brings the lamprey out of the mud. She's actually doing this particular demonstration at Chicken Creek, at one of the areas that is being restored. And So the question then was how the lamprey going to react when they get to trickle setting. So she's saying they're going to wiggle out of the little cave and come up to the surface, and then she can capture it. Okay, sorry about the sound thing. So let's talk about the outcomes for this project. So the wetlands adjacent to Chicken Creek will move from a heavily managed system to the natural system that existed historically. And because of the way that the creek meanders through the wetlands, the channel will go from about a half mile, which is what it was when it was a farm, to a creek that is almost 2 miles long. We'll end up with a natural ecosystem for vegetation and wildlife diversity, including fish and beavers. That system will be in place on this 280 acres of continuous wetland. It will also improve the quality of water in the Tualatin River. There'll be a significant reduction in the sediment that it's introduced into the Tualatin River. You can imagine with water flowing from what normally would be a 2 mile distance and have that all be going into the Tualatin River over a half mile, you're dumping a lot more mud and debris into the Tualatin River than will be whenever the Chicken Creek opens. It will also provide for cooler water. The water that's coming was going into the canals before, evenings and when there wasn't a lot of water, would bake in the sun and it would get very warm, and allowing a lot of invasives, bullfrogs and so on, to occupy that water space. When the water meanders slowly through the refuge with the Chicken Creek in place, it will be cooler, and there will be pools where fish and lamprey can rest and cool off. And more importantly, the reduction in sediment will happen because the water will be flowing more slowly, and the nutrients will be taken from it by going through all of that meandering, and we'll end up with a much more clean and beneficial Tualatin River. So what did the Friends do to make all this stuff or help all this stuff happen? We were involved early on in the project by going out into the community and doing presentations about here's what's going to be going on at your refuge, and here's why it's important and why you might want to pay attention to it. There's a lot of presentations that we did at community centers and farmers markets, and whenever we would have school visits come out, with particularly with the kids that are in higher grades, we would explain to them what Chicken Creek was and show them the beaver dams that were being occupied even before Chicken Creek started, just to make sure that the community knew what we were doing. We also submitted a whole series of grant proposals to partners in the community and other non-governmental organizations, with an outcome of collecting a lot of money to support this very meaningful effort by selectively choosing partners that have a stake in having the Chicken Creek project take place. For example, we got $440,000 in a 2 years Willamette water supply grant for the restoration that will help support staffing and other funding. We got $300,000 from Intel, who is a very active partner in trying to make community improvement projects funded. We got a $100,000 tree grant from Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District for the project that will cover the bridges that are going to be installed this year. They were supposed to be installed last year, but COVID-19 kind of slowed a lot of things down. And then we got $100,000 from the One Tree Planted award for 70,000 trees that will be placed into the main unit. And the Fish and Wildlife Service donated $119 for visitor services activities and restoration staff. So it's been a community effort. It's been an expensive project, but I think what's going to be fun is when it's done and we can see how the activities that were taking place have made the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge a good deal more like it should be. So there's lots more information about this if you'd like to look at it. This is the website for the Friends of Tualatin Refuge. And it's a pretty extensive website. It's just been upgraded, lots of new features in it. And then there's also the Fish and Wildlife website. It's fishandwildlife.gov, Refuge, Tualatin River, and you can see what's going on there. There's a tab that you can call up on the Fish and Wildlife Service website. It's called Refuge, capital RUGE, 2020. And that goes through a list of lots of projects that are taking place in our region to support the enhancement and restoration activities of not only Tualatin River, but other refuges that are in the community. So that's what I had to show you today. Juanita, Marilyn, could you let me know if there are any questions?
Yeah, so there has been one question so far, and because people are going to type questions, we'll just give them a couple of extra minutes to do that. But one question so far, someone was asking about what types of invasive plant species were removed when you guys started this project.
Well, there's a long list of them. I'm not a botanist, but there are a lot of them. I guess most notable is we continue to try to get rid of the English ivy, blackberries, poison oak. There's other big species that create like these threads that get tangled up in the equipment that are going through the property. And there's probably a list that I can point you to if you were to go to the Friends of the Tualatin River Tualatin Refuge. I think they list the invasives that they were targeting. And there are work parties that are called pretty much, I'd say every quarter, that volunteers can go out and get some instruction in what species they're trying to remove. I'd show you how to identify them and then give you the equipment that you need to go out and do that very, very important service. Same thing with planting. There'll be planting activities and planting days that are announced and will be posted on the Friends of the Refuge website. So if people want to engage and participate as volunteers, you're welcome to join.
Great, and I will send out the Friends website when I send out the recording from this as well. And then we have two more questions. So someone is asking, why are bullfrogs considered invasive species?
Invasives outcompete other species. Bullfrogs are perfectly natural and actually encouraged for growing in the east side of the United States. But a bullfrog will eat anything that it can fit in its mouth, to include baby ducks and other species of frogs and fish. So because the bullfrogs are big and large and highly hungry, they will take away a lot of the native species because they outcompete them. And they compete with them for habitat space as well. Similarly with nutria. Nutria are an animal that was introduced into the United States in the early 1900s because they look a lot like beavers, and it was thought that they could be a good source of pelts for, back then, felt hats, or beaver felt hats were all the rage. And they got the nutria up here, and the people that normally would buy beaver pelts looked at it and said, that's not a beaver pelt. That doesn't even look as good as a beaver pelt. So whoever was raising them just let them go into the wild. Now there's nutria all over the place, and they destroy banks of creeks and rivers and compete with regular beavers. So invasives is a relative term. It's like my biology teacher in high school once told me that a rose in a cornfield is a weed, because that's not where it's supposed to be. So invasive species are just like that. They're weeds because they're not where they're supposed to be. I like bullfrogs personally, but I don't like what they do. And when we tell the little kids that, yeah, they'll eat ducklings, and kids have a hard time imagining it, but it is true. They will eat ducks.
Okay, thank you. And then we have one more question. The question is, when will the bridges go in, and when will this be done and open to the public?
Well, that's a continually moving target. The bridges are supposed to go in by this fall. The right now, the refuge is open to the public on the trails. And you can walk the trails now. The visitor center is closed and the restrooms are closed, but we have porta potties in the parking lot. We encourage people to come out to the refuge. But the grand opening is supposed to happen, the last I heard was in October, but it was supposed to have been in June and now July and then September. It's a matter of having the permission from the Department of the Interior to open federal lands and buildings to the public. But they have given permission to open the trails, but we're not allowed to do on-site training exercises or field trips or anything like that. So what we're doing as a Friends organization and a Fish and Wildlife Service is we're doing, like you guys are, virtual trainings. Just this past week, I did 4 training sessions for a school in Sherwood Elementary School. And we had 10 sessions so we could expose the entire school population, 7th graders, into what goes on at the refuge. It was quite a success. I enjoyed doing that.
Great. Yeah. So I guess we'll just say check the website and maybe they'll probably announce it there. Great.
Yeah, we update the website as things happen. So I wish I could give you a regular answer, and it's certainly not up to me.
Yeah, we've all been there.
I'm sure you
know
have.
Exactly what you mean. Well, great. That's all of the questions that we have. So thank you so much